you never unsee Grenfell, you never unsmell Grenfell, you never unhear Grenfell, because it was almost surreal what you were seeing. And the aftermath of Grenfell has sunk a community.
Hello and welcome to Mirror Talks as we continue an important conversation around Grenfell, one of the biggest single injustices of the modern era and the latest example of the cover-up culture affecting so many areas of our society. You've seen the politicians quite literally walk away from the issue in Westminster, but we're going to stay with it across our platforms on the Daily Mirror as we speak to and for those people directly affected by that fire in the Tower Block in 2017. Also the people in properties around the country with genuine concerns that they too are not being heard. Yvette Williams MBE is the founder of Justice for Grenfell. She's worked tirelessly to ensure the voices of the dead and the people whose lives have been changed forever by events on that night are heard. The award-winning Wynne-Jones is the journalist who's covered the housing situation around the tower before and after the disaster. She's also done so much work with the families to tell you their stories. Welcome to you both. And the first place I would imagine to start is with that walkout of the MPs last week. And it came after the report emerged. So let's start with the report first of all, actually. What's your reaction now, a week on from it being released?
I mean, it's a rather large report, but you have to give due where it is due. Martin Morbick covered great ground in the report. I don't think that some crucial issues that he covered bear out in the recommendations. But if you consider the terms of reference, he did a good job in meeting those. If we had got things like race and discrimination, social inequality, the whole social housing piece into the terms of reference at the beginning, as we asked, I think the recommendations would have been a lot more powerful, and I think that's a pinnacle that he's missed there.
Natasha Alcock from Grenfell United says that perhaps Sir Martin could have put more pressure on the government to act on the findings. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think she's completely correct. I think that in the recommendations, he could have, and we say, given more agency to the community and empowered the community. Even some of the things that he asks for, like, a new regulator over the construction industry, he could have said, and actually, X% of those people need to be made up from community people or people with lived experience, just to make sure you were keeping them on the ball. And I think it's small things like that that are missing from the recommendations. We're still in a position where the recommendations bear out things still to be done to us
yes.
by the very people who we deem as being the perpetrators of the event. And so actually nothing's changing along the way.
Ros, you've covered events around Grenfell, as I was saying a second ago, before, during and after. A week on, what's your sense around the report?
I think that the report, I think it was important to have some of those things down in black and white, and I know that for a lot of bereaved and survivors who've been to the inquiry, they've lived the inquiry, they've heard that information, a lot of times, they're very familiar with it. But I think as a matter of public record, it's really important that some of that is just written down, that, that loss of life was avoidable. Like 72 people did not need to die. Those things need to be written down. I mean, I'd certainly agree with the fact that the recommendations could have been stronger. And I think the worrying thing for a lot of people is the idea that now and I'm sure we'll come to this, but now the Met are going to need 12 to 18 months to act on information that's pretty clear in black and white in the report.
Well, I was going to speak about that later, but let's do that now because it staggers me. And it's another example of what so many people say is can kicking. It's putting it off so that the people who should be under the microscope can basically, as people see it, escape justice. What's your view on that?
I mean, for me, it's... As a citizen, you expect the law to be applied equally to all. It is the foundation of any decent democracy that the law is applied equally. I mean, for us, that those organisations are in the frame, that they've interviewed over 50-odd respondents, that they've been walking around, or in one case sailing around on a yacht in the Mediterranean, scot-free for 7 years. You're like, well, you know, how does that tally up? How do you equate that in your mind? Because if it was an ordinary citizen that had caused that fire, this case would have been long and dusted. It would have taken a criminal justice route, and, you know, even while they were being criminally investigated, I think this is what we forget with the inquiry, that these people are still being criminally investigated for something. If I was being criminally investigated for that, my assets would have been frozen, my passport would have been confiscated. So why the dual treatment? Because you work for a particular company, own a particular company, you have political status, you are a civil servant, you know, you have public office in a local authority. Why does that label make you get differentiated treatment to the everyday citizen?
Lord MacDonald, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, he said that it could take a dozen years after the disaster before anyone is punished, and that's based on the Met Police claim that the force needs 12 to 18 months to go through the public inquiry findings before recommending charges. Now, in response to that, Mike Barton, formerly of the National Police Chiefs Association, has said it's questioned why it should take so long, and the former Met Police Chief Dal Babu has said similar. And Michael Mansfield, QC Ros, he represented bereaved survivors and residents at the inquiry. He said the police investigation should have come first.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big argument for that. And there's also, like last week when I was speaking to Karim Masili of Grenfell United, I interviewed him and he was saying, you know, there were days watching the inquiry where people were in the dock and he just thought, why not put the handcuffs on them now on the way out of the dock before they escape back to the Caribbean or France or like all these, wherever they live. And I'm inclined to agree. Any of the inquiry that I sat through, I just thought, why is someone not arresting them right now? Because Yvette's completely right. If the profile of those people was a bit different, they would have been nicked like immediately on like leaving the dock.
And that's quite interesting because at this point you've got to draw parallels with so many of the scandals across the country: COVID, Hillsborough, Windrush, Post Office, infected blood. There are so many others where there is a very similar pattern, and there are a lot of people who could be watching this thinking that happened to us. What's your view on that?
I mean, even further back, we're still waiting for an inquiry into Orgreave and what happened with the miners. You know, what do they not want us to know? I think it's really interesting you bringing up Mike Mansfield, because actually when we held the first silent walk a few days after the fire to bring calm to the area, he put out for the community, you know, the difference between inquests, inquiries, criminal investigations. And you're right, he did lean towards a criminal investigation. However, Theresa May had already announced that a public inquiry was going to happen with no stone unturned. And so it just started to grow legs. The police at the beginning had actually said, the investigation's going to run side by side with the inquiry. So you think, okay. And you just think, what have you been doing for 7 years? You know, if I was working that slow in my job, I'd be on some severe performance management regime with the idea of me losing my job. They watched the inquiry. As Karim said, you could have just picked up people there and then. That's all the evidence that you need. The report has taken the best part of 18 months. What have you been doing in that time? What do you need this extra 18 months for? Now, I'm no detective, but I do love Agatha Christie. And Miss Marple would have had this wrapped up a long time ago.
And it's no laughing matter, because I think as far as the pain that the families go through, the people connected with those who lost their lives are concerned, this is extending their trauma, isn't it?
Justice delayed, justice denied. And it is this idea that the longer you can keep something going, the more it falls out of people's consciousness, where they're not really sure what's happening because they're not hearing about it that much. They think it's all been sorted and solved.
Is that a fear for you, that people are going to be, even now, over Grenfell?
I think it's fair to say, look what's happened since Grenfell. You know, we've had the Windrush scandal, you know, the post office scandal has come to light. Contaminated bloods is happening. There's still an undercover policing inquiry going on. And, you know, for an ordinary citizen, you know, how much do you hold in your head? You know, you tend to kind of warm into what kind of directly affects you. Still buildings cladded. Why has that taken so long? You know, that's been placed in an economic argument where people are concerned, well, who's responsible for paying for it? Well, we don't care who's responsible for paying for it. Just take it down and then argue about who's responsible.
I remember on the day, I remember thinking things will have to change now. I thought many different things. I was there in the kind of early hours of the morning reporting. Very quickly, you think you're looking at a mass grave, obviously, and then very quickly people were saying to me, this is corporate manslaughter. I mean, people knew that by 6 a.m. on the day of the fire, right? The 7 years on, there's no charges. But I thought, because I'd been writing about inequality in the UK a lot at that time, nobody wanted to talk about it. I thought this is going to be a landmark moment now for this country, that something's got to change. Inequality's been made obvious. People have died because they weren't treated equally, because they weren't considered to be valuable citizens, because they weren't part of, you know, our Britain or whatever it was. And that was about race and class and immigration and like all sorts of different things. So in some ways, it's not just the idea that justice has not come for those families, which is bad enough, but the idea that our society is probably even more unequal by the time the Tories have left. Yeah. You know, there's been another 7 years austerity, another 7 years of the widening gap between rich and poor in the UK. All of these things have only got worse. Just seems, I don't know, I think it's like injustice upon injustice upon injustice, isn't it?
It is. Because I just think our local authority, RBKC, used austerity to cut back on the costs of Grenfell. But they were sitting down on over £270 million in their reserves. So they're just using the ideology at that time as a way to treat the north of the borough and the communities that they saw as a blight. So much of a blight that they don't really pay much attention to the internal refurbishment. It's just about, we've got to make this building look nice. So people that are on their way to Westfield to do their shopping in the village, and those who can see Grenfell on the skyline from the south, that it looks pretty, because you don't want to see the people that are living in there, because they're just almost irrelevant.
Yvette, what aspect of the report last week really did have an impact on you? Because there was so much greed, dishonesty, incompetence, malfeasance. There was so much in there that just repulsed so many people. But what one thing from the report really did say to you, I'm so fed up? What really struck you?
I think for me, obviously the buck passing, the disgusting nature of people like Pickles, who can just sit there blatantly and tell you, his time's precious. But a lot for me was what the covert detail, the under detail of things that people just see, that tier sees as normal. So even the way that the tender was handed out to Ryden, who then, undercut because they've had the nudge. We've got laws that says this thing doesn't happen. They will tell you it doesn't happen. They will tell you public procurement is, safe. It's tied by a public sector equality duty, all these things. And we believe them. People get stuff on merit. But, jobs for the boys, passing contracts out at a lunch, making little jokes about, I owe you a dinner, that kind of stuff. That insidious stuff that came out, if you were really listening to it, where you just think, no, you cannot tell me that we live in a fair and equal society when this stuff is just happening on a daily basis, not just happening in the construction industry. In fact, we need to move away from that. What happened at Grenfell is not a construction industry issue. It's not a social housing issue. It is the way that our society treats communities like those in North Kensington and get away with it. Those people live their lives as if they are untouchable. And then actually they're the very people who sit on the boards as the regulator, as the people who set, the law and the guidance. So you're actually stuck within that. And I think that plays out when you see who comes on as a respondent at the inquiry. Because I'm like, do they not employ any black and brown people? And that, where are they? And for me, the one missing group, demographic, that was never interviewed were the actual workers. And I'm going to sort of guess what they might have looked like.
I hear the emotion in your voice when you're talking. It really does anger you, doesn't it?
I was there that night. I was called to that fire to pick up a friend who had been evacuated. People don't understand the building burnt for 60 hours. We were walking around in it. When we say nobody of authority turned up, we mean nobody in authority turned up. No one. And you never unsee Grenfell, you never unsmell Grenfell, you never unhear Grenfell, because it was almost surreal what you were seeing. And the aftermath of Grenfell has sunk a community. We've got children who are growing up who witnessed the fire. Most primary schools in the area lost at least one child. The impact is huge. And it's a societal issue because, as we've seen, fires are happening all the time now. But other things are happening as well to communities that look like us. People can't feed their children. People can't heat their homes. And it's kind of, we want something that says, look, this has got to stop now. Okay? We need a new society. We need a better society. Not just in housing, but across the piece.
Ros, you were there on that night as well.
Yeah.
And it was a similar story for you.
Yeah, similar story. I can never forget that day. I used to work covering wars and disasters. I'd worked in all over Africa and all sorts of different places, seen some terrible things. But I think it's when something's in your own community, in your own city. I'm a Londoner. It's something that shouldn't be happening. It's preventable. It's not an act of, it's not a flood. It's not a, act of God in that sense. It's not even even an act of terrorism is in some way more understandable than what happened on that day, which was just neglect and contempt and like all of these things. And you know, I feel the same. I can't forget the smell of it. I can't forget seeing the cladding falling and saying to people, because I'd seen a lot of fires in my work, and I was like, what's that stuff falling on the floor? And people were saying, that's the cladding. And I was thinking, this is weird. You're sort of starting to piece things together. And I guess one of the things that I took away from last week was just the lack of remorse. That's the bit I cannot get. Like, if I was running Oconic or Kingspan or, you know, Ryden or any of these companies, or if I was Eric Pickles, or if I was David Cameron, or if I was any of these people, you would just want to say, I'm so sorry. Like, whatever, I'm not admitting, you know, you don't even have to admit that you're at fault, but you could just say, I'm really sorry. And it's one of the great, you know, regrets of my time in office that we didn't deal with people better, you know, at that time, or whatever. It's just, I don't know. I can't on a human level, I can't understand it.
Ros, what did you make when you of those images of politicians walking out of the chamber, the Commons chamber, as the Prime Minister was about to read the Grenfell inquiry report?
I found it very, very bizarre. I think there's ingrained in MPs, there's a habit of just leaving straight after Prime Minister's questions. They're all obliged to be there for Prime Minister's questions. And probably there's just a habit that, like, oh, Prime Minister's questions ended, I'm going off to my meeting. But you would hope that somewhere in their mind they would think, do you know what this tower is? It's even in the same borough, isn't it? It's like literally just up the road, and it's happened to people, and I can't understand what could be more important than sitting there listening to. And also it was undermining to, I think that actually Keir Starmer was trying to do something a bit different from the other prime ministers, and it undermined him in that action.
What message do you think it sent out to the wider public?
Well, we can all move on, you know, which obviously we can't, can we? When there's thousands of buildings that are still covered in cladding, and nobody's gone to jail. They're
public servants. So for me, if my MP hadn't turned up, I would want to get some reasoning from my MP as to why you weren't there.
Why he'd walked out.
Yeah. Why were you not there? What else was more important for you at that time? And you need to make a public statement about that.
What did you think when you saw those images?
I just thought it was just disgust. And I'm just like, after all the stuff that's gone on over the last 14 years, you would think MPs, many of them are new MPs coming in, you would think they would want us to see the best at them, at least at the beginning. But these people have no shame.
And a lot of them will pop up on Twitter and other social media purporting to care about the people either in the tower or in the borough, the poorest in our society. And yet they would walk away from that. So I shouldn't really get involved, but, you know, I do feel quite strongly about this too. And I think it sends out a terrible message on behalf of the people that those MPs are supposed to represent.
Yeah. Do they represent us? Because there's very few MPs now that kind of do really good constituency-based work. It is about their parliamentary careers and big P politics. And that's what they're measured by now. That lack of accountability to their local constituents is something else I think that needs to change. If we're going to look at society as a whole, if we're going to look at real democracy in progress, then that is something that we need to look at.
Okay. You both mentioned politicians. Ros, Yvette mentioned David Cameron. What do you read in his decision to react on social media rather than be interviewed?
I just thought it was cowardly. And he's someone who lives in West London as well, isn't he? I mean,
he lived about 150 metres from the tower.
I just think again, it's like, would you not have some message of feeling, you know, of empathy for those families? Why would you it's always about trying to cover up the bit that I did or whatever. There's like a lack of respect for the wider sense, and you know, it's a terrible thing to say, but he said he wanted a bonfire, didn't he? He said, I mean, it was literally like, we will burn all the, you know, we'll burn all the red tape. And we know that deregulation and all of that stuff obviously started in the Thatcher era, but was carried on by successive governments and prime ministers. And, well, that's where you end up, when everyone gets to check their own homework and everyone's, as you say, handing the contracts out over a nice lunch, and there's no regulator looking over their shoulder.
Over the weekend, he said that the inquiry agreed with him that fire regulations had not been part of the government's red tape drive, quote unquote, to cut regulations. Agreed with him, Yvette?
Well, I find that really strange, because when we had Boris Johnson as mayor, he was his best friend at the time, you know, they closed fire stations. You know, you cannot blame a poorly funded public service who doesn't quite get things right at the end of the day. You know, they're workers like anybody else. So for me, it's just an excuse. It's noise. He just wants to be heard and put his name back in the frame. And he's got to appease his friends. And Ross is right, you know, it does start with Thatcher, you know, and it's not only regulation, it's the privatisation kind of strolls forward, and immense strides it made. And so you find wherever things are under-regulated and privatised, money becomes the sole factor. But those are public services that we need. And those public services, disproportionately used by us, just become nothing. You know, we see it in care homes, we've seen it in transport, it's across the piece. Where it's private, where services we need, dentists people can't find, wherever a service is private, goes into private hands, it's about money. It's not about our needs and our care, the duty of care. That is driven down. And successive governments have taken it forward. Tony Blair didn't really bring any more in, but actually he's complicit because he didn't halt it either. You let it go, you went with whatever you needed to go with.
Well, Natasha Alcock said that no government of any persuasion comes out of this with their hands clean, if you like, because there are so many individuals who could have done something and didn't.
And remember, they're making choices around regulation, around deregulation, privatisation, because they know that any negative impact is going to be for communities like ours. It would be very different if it was something affecting that top tier and elite and political class. It is because they know we're the ones that are going to come off worse. And that's the obscene and disgraceful thing about it, because they know we're disproportionately impacted.
You mentioned Eric Pickles. He's blamed middle-ranking officials for failing to act on a coroner's warning about fire safety. He's been urged to resign since last week. Do you think he will?
I very much doubt it. I just, again, it's like, in what world do you blame the middle-ranking people? I don't know. It's like the worst ever manager, isn't it? Where they won't take it on the chin themselves, and they just say, "Oh, it's these people did it." It's just like, it's honestly. And is he? Am I right in thinking he's a government advisor on ethics at the moment? I think I read that this week.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave that floating.
I mean, that's been a position that's kind of come and gone over the years. But to put someone like Pickles in, you know, come on. And I mean, he's been everywhere in society. Criminal justice, he's been across communities, he's been across, and he's never done a good job in any. He's incompetent. And as I say, if it was you or I, you know, we're managed, performance managed in a different way, or we're dismissed in a particular way. But these people, they actually are walking around like they're untouchables.
You've both been with the story now for 7 years. How has it affected you?
I mean,
it almost... So on the best of days, you have some hope that somewhere, someday, I always akin it to the Emperor's New Clothes. Someday, a little boy at the back is going to put his hand up and say, you lot are obscene, you're naked. You haven't got no fancy clothes. Stop trying to kind of tell us otherwise. And then at worst, I think, I don't belong here. They are doing everything they possibly can to let me and people that look like me know that. And what alternative arrangements do I possibly need to make for me and my family? How do I keep my family safe here when 90% of the time there is some kind of negativity that comes out that makes us almost know our place, that we're only temporal, and that you're never British through and through, you're only British born. And that's really worrying. That's quite frightening for the generations to come.
What impact has it had on you, Ros?
I think that I still find it, even as an outsider, someone who didn't come from that community, I still find it very hard to look at images of that fire. The smell of it comes back to me. But on a positive side, I would say that I've made a lot of friendships with people in the community. I've seen the best of the community, like the way that people came together, because, and again, in comparison to many other tragedies and disasters that I've been to, the levels of chaos. I must have walked around the tower 10 times in the beginning thinking, where's the point where all the council will be there and the fight people, I just kept saying, who's in charge? Like, what? I was just, that standard procedure in an emergency, it wasn't there. It was utter chaos. And so people had to stand up and start taking charge themselves. Some of the, obviously, people from the mosque or people from the churches, but also community leaders or just mums or whatever, just people sort of came together. And I think one of the things that I take from Grenfell was the incredible strength of that community. And maybe that was because that community already knew it had to do things for itself because it had been let down sort of plenty of times before. I think there was an interesting thing about Carnival, which I know you're really involved with, that because of Carnival, because of the history of the mangrove, like even all of these things, that part of West London has its own networks, and thank goodness it does, because it had to stand up for itself.
Just to stick with you for a moment, because you didn't just go there to cover what happened that night. You had been covering the area before. Just tell us about that and why.
Yeah, so I'd been there the previous week. I was writing a story. Some people had written... So I write a column for the Mirror called Real Britain, which writes about kind of social injustice and so on. And a lot of it is responsive because people will write in and say, Ros, could you come to my community and write about this? So some people had written to me to say, we've got an estate in our borough called the Sutton Estate, and it's got these hundreds of houses in it, but it's all behind barbed wire and blocked off. And we're thinking, hold on, we're in temporary accommodation with our babies or whatever. So why is this shut off? Because apparently it's being sold for luxury flats. So I thought, this is an interesting story. So I went, and these campaigners had said to me, if you're writing about the borough, you should write about Grenfell Tower. Some real problems there. There's a guy called Ed Daffan. They gave me his phone number. So I think it was probably only 3 days later. It was the same heat wave. I remember it was very, very hot that week. And I got called from the news desk, actually from my editor, to say, could you go to the fire? There's a fire happening in West London. And I put on the television and I just thought, I don't know what the hell's going on. I'll just get over there and try and find out. And then when I realised it was Grenfell on the way, I was thinking, that's the tower that those campaigners were telling me about. So I rang the number of Ed Defan's number, and obviously he didn't answer because he was being evacuated at that time out of the fire. He was in the fire. And I still think of this there was like a sort of strange period where when I eventually spoke to him, I still didn't realise that he had just literally come out of the fire when I first spoke to him. And that these campaigners had, I don't know, it was a very strange week, but I suppose it added to my sense that this was going to happen. People knew it was going to happen. People were warning it was going to happen. It did happen, and even now, there's nothing to be done to prevent it from happening again. And that's the bit that I can't. Even as a journalist, I can't get my head around. Never mind if I lived there.
Well, you mentioned your context. People sometimes think that journalists don't care, but it's had a big impact on you, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it has. Of course, it has. And I think it's as I say, it's when it's in your own city, and you feel very angry on behalf of those people. And I don't know. I mean, I live in Peckham, quite a similar community in some ways. And I can imagine if something like that happened there, the community would come together in the same
down the road
in the same way. Oh yeah, well, exactly. That's a really good point. So I remember the fire at Lacanau House, which is the one that all the original recommendations were ignored, and nobody looked at them. So, had that been listened to,
And guess whose department was responsible for that one?
I think it was Mr. Pickles, wasn't it?
Sure was.
Lord Pickles.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, he's benefited. Listen, there's nothing to say he's benefited specifically from that, so I'll be careful with my language there. But there has been frustration at the fact that certain people whose roles in the Grenfell Tower disaster were questionable at best and criticised by the report, but it hasn't really harmed their careers. That's probably the most diplomatic way of putting it. I think about Lord Barwell as well, who has had some criticism. You're nodding, Yvette. What's your view?
I just think, as you said that, not only has it not harmed their careers, they've benefit from promotions into positions of greater power as a result of their hand in Grenfell.
I mean, Karim from Grenfell United, again last week, said Lord Barwell should be stripped of his peerage. I've heard a number of people say that. A lot of people think Pickles should be stripped of his. It's I don't know. It's unfathomable, really.
I just think if successive governments, public inquiries are in the gift of the government of the day. They decide who gets a public inquiry. Now, if you're going to put public inquiries before criminal investigations, then actually those people who you know are part of that should actually be suspended from any position that they hold. And I'm telling you, if they are, you won't get inquiries lasting 7 years.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. And I mean, the other thing I was going to say is this week, the COVID inquiry is sitting, and that's refused the testimony of a lot of ordinary families who've asked to be involved. And one of the reasons that Grenfell report has been really powerful is because it has actually heard from the 72 families, bereaved and survivors. So the idea that we're now going to have this inquiry for COVID, but families in a similar situation are not going to get that voice. That's sort of live kind of happening this week. But again, it's like years and years, and what will the recommendations be, and who are the people that have profited, from PPE, VIP, lane stuff. It's almost like history just keeps repeating itself.
I know you're very well up on the specifics of what you both are around cladding and the various companies and who bears responsibility. But I want to ask a more general question. Why did the lowest industry standard become the benchmark?
The race to the bottom, because that's where you make your most money. That's where your profits come from. And especially when you're making it off communities like ours, that's at the back of your mind. But you only make that choice if they come and say, you know, the cladding is for, you know, one of the earldoms somewhere. You're probably not going to sell them that, regardless of, you know, how cheap it's cheap for a reason. It's cheap because those products are meant to be wholesale to communities that look like ours, but you can still make enough profit off it to hand out to your shareholders at the end of the day. And it's simple. We're not saying they make these decisions deliberately, but at best they're indifferent.
And some of them weren't indifferent. Like, that was the shocking thing about some of the text messages that came out, where people were texting saying, in this department we just lie all the time. You know, it was like, oh, well, you know, it was literally like, oh, by the way, our stuff doesn't work properly, but we lie about it. Like, how could you sleep at night?
One of them even made a joke about, you know, the possibility of a fire like the one in Dubai. But it's normal. It's that when they see us, and actually they don't, because we don't feature to them. We're just consumers at the end of the day, and it's just the poorest of the poor. It is awful that human beings function like this, but we know that they do, and unfortunately they're the ones in positions of power.
But the other thing that really struck me when we were just talking about this on the way in was when you were saying about how within days, and this was very similar to what happened at Hillsborough, the community was being called out as if it was the community had caused it. It was it was like the community's at fault. They had loads of people jammed into the houses, or they did this, or they did that, or they're all like illegal immigrants. Yeah. You were saying that hate mail was coming in. Can you imagine in the aftermath of a tragedy like that, people were getting hate mail? Because why? They fled from a burning building.
Hats off, the media criticisers have done really good pieces on this. And it is, on the day of the fire, it goes out, not that there's cladding falling off the building, so we might want to look at that first. It is, you know, the building, it's all subletters, you know, they're all undocumented migrants in there. They set the tone for
the way that people perceive
it's the people that live there. There has to be a reason, and they have to be the culprits in that fire happening, and also that the fire started in a fridge or from a fridge. So they thought, yeah, that's how those people live, and the tone of the story goes from there. And it's at a time when, as we said, austerity, you know, we've had the immigration vans round, actually it's amazing, immigration vans round, which is why we did the 3 billboards outside Grenfell. It was just like, yeah, let's take some billboards round. They like billboards. They send them round to tell us to get out of town. Let's show them what we think of them. So, you know, Islamophobia is really high, post-911. You know, these are all things that feed into that. And as the community is organising because no one turns up, we see documents at the inquiry that says literally there's some troublemakers down in the community and maybe we need to send armed police down to keep them intact. So when you're at that mindset, our lives don't matter. Nelson Mandela said our lives are cheap. They don't care. We're a blight on their society. And that's the lens they look through, and it's the discourse that comes up, whether it be media or otherwise, that says they're deviant, and so you don't treat them with a straight line.
Are there people who are still living in temporary accommodation?
I don't think so. I remember hearing last year there was about 3 families that were still waiting for houses.
So my knowledge is that there's no one in emergency accommodation, i.e. hotels, but there are some people who are still in temporary, decent temporary accommodation, we hope, that have not chosen to take permanent homes.
It was very difficult because a lot of people, obviously, I mean, 7 years is plenty of time to get everybody housed. But I remember in the early days, there was quite a lot of people who offered things in tower blocks. They weren't, people were like, I want to live on the ground floor. Thank you. I want two ways out of my house. I don't, I either want to be able to see the tower or I don't want to be able to see the tower. So people had quite specific things and anxieties and PTSD. But yeah, so far as I know now, I think most people are reasonably housed.
One of the things that came up, Natasha Alcock has spoken about this as well, phase 1 of the recommendation still haven't been completed. There are still disabled residents for whom the facilities are still perilous. What's our view on this?
Well, actually, the new housing minister, she actually said she would change that and bring in legislation around PEEPs, personal evacuation plans. She does that 2 days before the phase 2, the final report, came out. So let's see if they do that. But it's all right making these statements, but who's monitoring it? Who's evaluating it? Do you only find out that it's not working properly when another disabled person doesn't get out of a building? So these grand gestures and statements are fine, but who's the overseer? Because the overseer tends to be the very landlords who let people in Grenfell down in the first place.
I mean, it was very lucky that no one died in Dagenham like last week. And that was a fire and Catford
on the very day.
Fighting that one on the day, yes.
Yeah.
As Keir was making his speech in Parliament.
Yeah. It's pretty. I can't imagine what it would be like to go to sleep in one of those buildings or to put my kids to sleep in one of those buildings. It would be, I think it must
they
be
knew
terrifying.
Within days of Grenfell that there were thousands of buildings, not just residential either, schools, this hospital, with that material on them. 7 years down the line, over 50% of them still remain.
Well, yeah, as if to illustrate that point, there are 4,630 residential buildings in England, not just London, with unsafe cladding, according to figures that were released last month. What can we do to protect those residents of those properties?
I think, what can we do? We just have to keep shouting. We just have to make sure that they're heard. For me, the arguments around the remediation work is all about money. Who's responsible? Is it the developers? Is it government, insurance companies, etc.? But for me, that should be a secondary argument. Your first argument is to save lives and take the material off the buildings and then go and argue later on about who's going to pay for it. Don't leave people living like that. Can you imagine going to bed every evening?
I mean, those developers should be made to pay. They've made plenty of money. They continue to make plenty of money. I think they should be made to pay to get the cladding off, particularly where they're the ones who've lied about it, or they've, some level of culpability. There could be a fund. I mean, the problem that the Labour Party have got, the government have got, is that they've got this massive plan to build all these houses, social housing revolution, but they've also got the existing houses are not safe, many of which are social housing. So but we need to see that cladding is part of that initiative to have safe social housing.
I mean, they've made a statement about not giving any more public contracts to these companies. But I'm just like, so have you been giving them public contracts over the last 7 years while they've been criminally investigated for what happened? And you're like, come on, this is sloppy. For a first world government, there's something else behind that, and they need to come clean about that. And I think we just constantly need to be in their faces saying, we're watching you.
Ros, I want to ask you about the inquiry finding from Sir Martin Morbeck about the companies that made the cladding and insulation products behaving with quote-unquote systematic dishonesty. They've either declined to comment or denied that finding.
Yeah.
What's the next step?
I mean, being found to be systematic dishonesty in your company is a pretty, I don't know, I mean, to me, there's all sorts of different ways that you can look at things. Like, if it's incompetence, if it's criminal incompetence, I think that's one thing. People can be incompetent, they can make mistakes, or they, maybe haven't employed the right people to do those jobs. And that is still, obviously, can have very severe consequences. But the idea that there were people just lying as a matter of course, and that was so entrenched in the system, is just, I don't know.
It's cultural, isn't it? And it's institutional. And I think Lawrence inquiry, institutional racism, where are we now?
Well, this is the problem, because now the community is being asked to have faith in the police.
Where are we now? Now we're at a point where the commissioner doesn't even agree with the term institutionalised racism. So it's kind of, what faith do we have? And I think the other key thing from the inquiry is we have to equate it with Hillsborough. Hillsborough takes over 30 years to actually get a couple of people in the dock. And the judge says, they changed their inquiry statement for their criminal investigation statement, and actually that's fine because the inquiry is not a legal entity. And that's the end of the story. So why would you have faith in that process?
I want to end on a positive note, because you've written so often about the humanity of the families that you encountered, that you wrote about. You would have been worked with the families and been able to draw strength from their resilience throughout what has been an horrific time for them. So I want to just look for a couple of moments of areas where we might have hope of a more positive outcome for those families.
I mean, I would really want to pay tribute to Grenfell United, because I just think they're absolutely extraordinary to have come together as bereaved, as survivors of that, and to fight this on so many levels, how people have that strength. And we have seen that, the Hillsborough families are extraordinary, the COVID bereaved families are extraordinary. Lots of these, there's a lot of precedent for communities that come together, but I have to say that many people that I've met in the community, they still can't grieve. They can't move on until there's criminal charges or until cladding's down. And they have somehow had to put all of their own grief to one side to just get on and become legal experts and become, Natasha Elcott worked in retail. She was like stacking shelves. She's now an expert on all legal matters and public inquiries. Like, that's an extraordinary transformation. And actually what it speaks to is the fact that these people, Tiago Alves is another one. He was like a young guy living in that tower. He's now, he's become this incredible scientist. He's gone on to do these sort of amazing things while also attending the inquiry all the time. So what it says to me is actually the people in the tower, far from being the dregs of society as they were painted, were actually pretty amazing human beings, and they've achieved pretty amazing things. I feel proud to know them.
Yvette?
Yeah, I think I sort of agree with that, and think let's hope. There was, say, for the public inquiries, lessons learned. Well, let's talk about the lessons learned as a community. And I think it's something about how our young people go forward and what they take with them. Does this give them, or let's let it give them some kind of strength to be kind of, the brilliant people that they need to be, and to go forward and never let anybody, forget what happened at Grenfell. but also to kind of know that they can put themselves in positions where they can show these people, do you know what I mean? We're here to stay. We're good for your society. This is what a good society looks like. And maybe you need to follow our example, because we're certainly not following yours. So, yeah, I think positive. I think real hope for the next generation going forward, who came from the worst of things. It's that survival mechanism. It's that... we've always been like a jamming community, kind of moving on, and to have pride in that, and to say, yeah, we're going to keep this going, and I'm going to show them that, you know, my community we're strong, we're resilient, and we're not going to be pocketed in some little area that you post us in. So yeah, that's a good hope for me.
It's a great hope.
The strength is with the people, and this is the core of what Grenfell is about. Never about the building. It was always about the people.
Well, there we must end for now. Big thanks to Yvette and to Ros. But as I mentioned earlier, the conversation will continue across the Daily Mirror, in print and online. We want your input too. Send us your thoughts, your videos, your opinions. Tell us about the conditions you're living in. Tell us who you've been talking to in the councils and in Westminster, because now is the time for accountability. And we're going to continue using our platforms to demand it. Bye for now.